pricing, right? So what is this differential analysis? That's actually pretty kind of maybe one of the most important topics in this class. Because one of the, in some schools, this course is called Management Accounting for Decision Making, right? So far, anything we were doing was more about like sort of look backwards looking type of stuff, right? So how much money, what is profitable, how do we allocate costs? It's typically after decisions have been made. Now, here today we're going to talk about sort of future decisions. What are essentially kind of scenarios, right? We have an alternative A versus alternative B, which is the preferred alternative, right? And the preferred alternative is always going to be the one that makes us more money. So we're going to take a very kind of laissez-faire economics view here. We're going to say in this framework that whatever we decide to do is going to be based on whatever is going to make us more money. So essentially, what this analysis, so-called differential analysis, boils down to is just a notion that you have multiple scenarios. Each scenario produces some hypothetical revenue, some hypothetical costs, and we will go with a scenario that makes us more money, that is more profitable, right? So that's what differential analysis is about. And it could take many forms. I mean, I'm sure if you in your daily life you could say, okay, should I buy or sell? Should I build or do it myself or hire somebody, right? Like I remember in the very first day of class, I started by saying, does it make sense for me to cut my own grass versus hire a lawnmower, right? That's a type of a differential analysis, right? Except, of course, I kind of framed it a little bit differently in terms of opportunity cost, right? So, I said, okay, well, if I, should I cut my grass myself or should I hire a person or a company to do it? Well, think about it, what do I gain, what do I lose, right? If I do it myself, I save money from paying somebody, right? What do I lose? Well, I lose potentially, the revenue or something that I could, or the profit from some other alternative, right? If I go ahead, if I have a question.
Yes, I have a question, Professor. Can we say that differential analysis is the same as opportunity cost?
I wouldn't say it's exactly the same thing, but goes to the same idea, right? In other words, opportunity cost, I think, is a broader notion. When we talk about differential analysis in this context, we talk about typically we have a very limited what's called opportunity set, right? Opportunity cost kind of is a broader concept that says, okay, you have to, and also not kind of you have to think about all possible alternatives, or here we're only focused on sort of a fixed set of alternatives, right? In some ways, yes, right? It goes towards kind of the same core idea, right? At the end of the day, you need to compare sort of expected benefit, net benefit of each alternative, and pick an alternative with the expected net benefit. Net benefit, I mean benefit minus the cost of the alternative, right? And that's what we mean by relative profitability. So the goal here is to select the opportunity with the best expected outcome. All right. Differential analysis, also known as incremental analysis or relevant cost analysis, is a decision-making technique that focuses on the differences between two or more alternatives. It helps managers evaluate the impact of differential choices on costs, revenues, and ultimately profits. The key components of differential analysis include, so what are they? Relevant versus sunk costs. So in the end of the day, like this is kind of another element here. Sunk costs are sort of key to here, right? If the cost has already been incurred, it's irrelevant to the next decision, right? So, so therefore, a very basic principle we use this differential type of analysis is if there is fixed cost versus variable cost. Fixed costs typically are more likely to be sunk, not always, right? But what would be, why am I saying that fixed costs typically are more likely to be sunk? Because here's the classic example that we're going to talk about. Should I accept a special price on the product or something special order, right? So I have some extra capacity, I have a plant, I'm producing products for sale and for sale for $100, and somebody says, okay, can you make a special order, produce 100 units for me for $85, right? So, you know, theoretically, we talked about it and I gave you an example that maybe $85 doesn't cover the average cost of production, but it covers the variable cost of production. So in that environment, you should accept it, because so long as you have capacity to produce the order, you have positive contribution margin, because you already built the plant. You're not required to build more capacity. As you know, you're just basically using up unexpected. You're using up unneeded capacity. You know, what would be the typical example of what companies do? So, you know, if there's like last minute airline sales, right? You can buy tickets and at the last minute at a high discount, right? On a particular, when you go on a plane. That's a classic example of this, right? Because, you know, why do airlines do that? Well, they're flying a plane anyway, right? And that plane has, you know, 10 unused seats. So they're still better off if they sell it at the last minute at a 50% discount, right? Rather than not sell it, assuming there's no other alternatives. Or conversely, I can switch it the other way. I could say, look, you know, for example, let's say there's a big event going on. There's a huge last minute huge demand for an event or whatever. And, you know, I was looking at one such event recently in Washington, D.C., and the hotels around that event that normally go for $300 a night, we're going for $1,000 a night. And that's because there is limited capacity. And also, you know, you want to try at that point to squeeze your customer as much as you can, because you're not going to build up another hotel to meet this demand. So you want to sell it to the customer that is willing to give you the most amount of money. That's the bottom line. So, you know, so when you do this kind of differential analysis, basically anytime fixed costs come up, unless, you know, an alternative you're considering requires incurring additional fixed costs, we're going to assume fixed costs are fixed. Fixed costs are sunk, I'm sorry. Does that make sense? And
yes.
So, but there is such a thing that, you know, even though it sounds like pretty obvious that you should do that, most people don't think like that, because most people have something called they suffer from something called sunk cost fallacy. And the sunk cost fallacy is a cognitive bias or logical error that occurs when people make decisions based on the amount of resources, such as time, money, or effort, they've already invested in a particular endeavor, rather than considering the current and future value of costs associated with that decision, right? And I gave you that example again for myself. There are some projects of mine that I've been working on for 10 years, and I really should have given them up a long time ago. Really, just because, and yet I feel like, well, if I just do a little bit more work on this, maybe it will go somewhere, because I feel bad about spending all this time and getting nothing for it. And the idea here is that the expected value of my costs are sunk. What I've done in the past doesn't matter. But what matters is what is the expected benefit from continuing on this project. And the expected benefit is obviously much lower than the expected cost of money or effort that I would be spending on it, right? Because most likely they won't go anywhere. And in fact, I recently abandoned the project, or basically when I said, okay, well, you know, I know pretty well this is not going anywhere, and so finally I had to let it go. Sometimes that's called in economics abandonment option. So we have this idea that we as human beings, we feel bad when we give up on something, but in reality, giving up on something at times is the right thing to do, right? Because there's an expression that doing something becomes more of a liability rather than an asset, right? And that's when, like, whatever you are emotionally invested in actually turns out to be more of a liability on you, right? It actually doesn't give you, yes, you have this emotional pain, emotional desire to continue to get it to some fruition, but in reality, whatever it will produce for you will be much lower than the effort you will continue spending on it, right? Does that make sense? I'm sure you can come up with situations like that from your own life. And that's the notion of sunk cost fallacy. And sunk cost fallacy is very important. So in other words, individuals tend to continue with a project or course of action because of the resources they've already sunk into it, even when they may not be the best choice going forward. This fallacy can lead to irrational decision-making because it overlooks the principle that past investments should not influence future choices if those investments cannot be recovered and are relevant in the current situation, right? And the key element here is if those investments cannot be recovered, right? In other words, don't keep doing something unless you are convinced that, in fact, the future payoff will cover whatever you spend. So it's important to evaluate decisions based on their expected future outcomes and potential benefits rather than dwell on what's already been spent. Okay. All right, so we talked about sunk costs. Now let's talk about opportunity costs. So I think it was a question about opportunity costs. Opportunity costs represent potential benefits foregone when one alternative is chosen over another. Opportunity costs are important in differential analysis. They reflect the true cost of making a particular choice. All right, so and what does it mean? So this last line here is that opportunity costs are important in differential analysis as they reflect the true cost of making a particular choice. And that's the idea that's why I said opportunity cost is a broader concept, because it's not, here we're going to focus, buy or sell. Give a special price, don't give a special price, but maybe there's like 5 other choices also of doing something else, right? Potentially. So the opportunity costs consider all possible choices, not just necessarily these 2 choices. Okay. All right. So what are the different type of differential analysis that exist out there? And I'll go to some examples. So whether, for example, it's relevant to price. How do you price new products, right? How do you determine what's the optimal price of the product? So how do you price products? So you need to first think about, okay, what are the relevant costs of production, which is direct material, labor, overhead. What's the expected revenue, right? So and then it will, if you know what the expected revenue is, expected costs are, relevant costs, that will give you expected contribution margin. And the bottom line is you price it on the basis of the contribution margin. So essentially fixed costs are sunk at this point, viewed as sunk, and you pick a product with highest contribution margin. Or you can also do it backwards. If you want to determine the price, you say, okay, this is the amount of contribution margin I want to get, and that's the price I want to set at. So that's kind of what drives us to some special price. How do you make special pricing decisions? And so I told you, special pricing decision. Basically, if somebody offers me like a big order at the discount, the bottom line is, at the minimum, you should have a positive contribution margin on it. And so long as you're, that's so long as you're working under capacity. Similarly, it comes up in the realm of discontinuing products. Should I continue a product or discontinue product, right? Right? Is it really, and that's kind of like, should I continue working on this paper versus not, right? So that's a very similar type of a story. How do we price products? Different ways to price product. That's more of a marketing and management accounting. So you can price products on the basis of the markup, right? So you can say cost plus, right? So I will take the cost plus, add a certain margin to that. So that works in a situation where you're what's called price maker rather than a price taker, right? In other words, the environment, you're kind of more of a monopolist, right? You can dictate prices to your customers, right? So one situation where we see a lot of like this kind of pricing is in government contracts, because government basically pay, they will have, that's kind of the model that they want, and they will have a competitive bidding process, but typically the price is set on the basis of cost plus some sort of a margin. If you are more of a market-oriented environment, more competitive environment, then like the airlines, for example, right? The prices are driven more by competition, and so you have less ability to dictate prices than you just sort of, or for example in retail, that you see more of a, you kind of observe what else is doing and set your prices that way. Value-based pricing, it's again also sort of like differentiated product pricing, more like you set prices on the basis of perceived value of the product. So a classic example is Teslas. Right? Anybody here drives a Tesla in my class? I'm guessing not, because otherwise you wouldn't be doing, going to school at night. But I have a friend who, he's pretty wealthy. And I called him up several weeks ago, and he tells me he decided to buy a Tesla. And I said, so how much did you pay? He said, well, it said $50,000. No, he bought a Tesla for $90,000. But what's interesting is, didn't really buy it. He put a $200 deposit on an order of a $90,000 Tesla. So okay, I said, great. That's not something I could ever hope for. Not that I would ever want to drive a Tesla, because I'm a horrible driver, and if I would damage it, and I would feel horrible about it. But then I called him up a couple of weeks later and said, okay, well, did you get your Tesla? He said, no. I said, why? Well, they keep delaying the delivery date, and he was very upset. So they were supposed to deliver them in December, and now it's in January. And I said, well, why wouldn't you just lose your, walk away and lose your $200? And that's it. Well, he really wants a Tesla. So this is an example of value-based pricing, right? Essentially, Elon Musk can dictate the price. He can dictate the delivery time, because everybody wants a Tesla. Another thing, so one measure of which kind of like who dictates the pricing is this notion of price elasticity. And that's the idea of how responsive the prices are to demand, right? If in the highly competitive markets, prices tend to fall faster if the demand goes down, right? And conversely, they tend to go up faster when demand goes up, right? So it's a more steep kind of, if you think about the price quantity function, it's a more steep curve. It's a highly elastic type of highly elastic environments, and vice versa. All right, so and you've all seen psychological pricing, which is when I came to America, I couldn't understand why everything that's has like a 99 in it, 9.99, 10.99, 11.99. That's just to give you off 1 cent to make you feel better that you pay slightly less. All right. So what does differential analysis look like? So this is one example. So you have sort of like, you can see 2 income statements, alternative 1, alternative 2. You look at the differential. The most important part here is the bottom. Which one of those 2 alternatives produces better profit? This is, in this case, this one. So you choose alternative B, right? So here's another example, right? Let's look at this problem. Coffee Express, a small coffee shop looking to expand its product offerings beyond coffee. The company is evaluating 2 alternatives, sandwiches and cookies, right? So annual projections for sales, sandwiches are as follows: sales 18,000, variable cost 13,000, fixed cost 500. Annual projections for sales of cookies is for sales 10,000, variable cost 3,000, no additional fixed cost. Now remember, in this case, fixed costs are not sound, because you would have to incur additional fixed costs, right? So they're trying, so you need to consider them. So which one should you take? Well, you just put them on an Excel spreadsheet. You put some revenues in one column, so one row, expects variable cost in the other, fixed cost in the third, and it produces that second alternative, cookies, results in higher profit. So you should go with cookies. That's as simple as that. So then the question becomes, another type of a decision you can make is whether you want to continue with the business or not, right? Whether you want to continue or discontinue a product or a business. So here's an example of another differential analysis that does that. The other very common one, whether you want to produce a good certain product yourself versus buy it from someone else. And we've seen it a little bit in transfer pricing discussion, a little bit in transfer pricing discussion. In the end of the day, you just have to go with the one that produces the highest profit. All right, so here's another example. Assume Tony's T-shirts make shirts for local soccer, baseball, basketball, and other sports teams. The owner, Tony, purchases the shirts and prints graphics on shirts for each team. The graphics were designed several years ago, so design costs are no longer incurred, right? So design costs are sunk in this case. On average, Tony sells 1,000 shirts each month. Typical monthly financial data is follows. So here you have data on the shirts, on the 1,000 shirts again. And a representative of a local high school recently approached Tony to ask about one-time special order. So I told you about special order. High school will be hosting statewide track and field event and willing to pay Tony $70 per shirt. So right now they're asking for a $3 per shirt discount. Because enough idle capacity exists to handle the order, it will not affect sales, right? So in other words, like that's the other thing sometimes. When you have this additional special order, if it's very big, will it something to consider, which is not the case here, but something to consider is whether it will harm your demand for your other products, right? So that's something that's kind of also we need to think about. In this case, it doesn't. Then Tony has the factory space and machinery able to produce more T-shirts. So, and what it means is in this case also is that the fixed costs, whatever the fixed costs were before the production of this special order, should not be considered because they already been incurred. They're already producing it. So, like, the only thing that you need to really worry about is the contribution margin on the special order. Tony incurs the same variable cost of $13 per unit to produce special order and will pay from $600 to design the graphics that will be printed on the shirts, right? So that's additional fixed cost, which is not sunk. All right, and then it says the special order will not have other effect on Tony's monthly fixed costs, right? So here's an example of how it's solved. You can go through the math. So alternative one considers no special order. Alternative two combines the existing sales with this additional sales. So that's why the revenues are higher. That's why variable costs are higher. And you can see it's 20,000. That was the original revenue plus $17 times 200 shirts is the first one. And then you do the same thing with variable costs. The fixed costs are, they're the same really. Plus you just need to add $600 of this incremental fixed costs, right? And so in the end of the day, it ends up being that you make more money with the special order rather than without. So that's why you should accept the special order. All right, so we talked about the product pricing already. That's one thing. One type of costing I didn't mention. There's also something called target costing, and that's kind of like a market-based costing, but you want to also try to reduce costs to meet the market demand, to what the market wants. So I already told you cost plus a method of product pricing. Price is set by adding markup or profit margin to total cost incurred. The goal of cost plus method is to ensure the selling price covers both direct and indirect costs. All right, so the point is here is that you just take the total. How you tell a selling price, you add you essentially mark it up. You add 20% above the cost or something, and that's your cost. Something called dynamic pricing. That's more just kind of like you change prices with demand. You increase them when demand is high. You reduce them when demand is low. That's what airlines do. That's what hotels do. That's an example of dynamic pricing. All right, so there's some considerations. You want to see how sensitive the market is to your pricing, right? So that airlines have this whole science of how they do it. That's why every once in a while, if you want to fly somewhere, they raise prices on certain days of the week. They reduce. There's certain flights. Tuesday or Wednesday typically are the cheapest airline tickets, because people that go on business, when do they go? They go Sunday or Monday, come back Friday or Saturday. So those tend to be the most expensive days to fly, right? Middle of the week, typically people don't fly so that's when it's a cheaper time. So that's an example of kind of market sensitivity. If another airline significantly discounts prices, then you want to match, right? Because you don't want to lose all market share. So, oftentimes airlines engage in what's called price wars. These are examples of real-time adjustments. You can try to what's called price discriminate, or there's that term is segmentation, which is you try to sell slightly different products to different customers, and that allows you to charge more of certain people versus less, certain groups versus other groups, and so on. So this is kind of what dynamic pricing is about. Competition-based pricing, I told you, it's basically your price, not the price maker, you're price taker, and you try to do, match the competition. And dynamic pricing is actually kind of a type of competition-based pricing. Our target costing is a pricing method used in businesses to manage costs effectively and ensure profitability while aligning their product or services prices with customer expectations and market conditions. So that's the idea is, okay, you have a certain desire for certain profitability, but then you try to cut costs to make more money. You have a certain range which you try to target. All right. Okay, so that's something for you can take a look at if you're interested. All right, so the other idea that we talk about is this production bottleneck. How do you price products that are when there's a bottleneck, when essentially at the point of manufacturing or production process where the flow of materials, work, information is slowed down or impeded, right? So if you can't, let's say you have 3 products that you can produce, but because of your capacity constraints or because of some sort of a problem, because of the ability of the machine to make them, you can not produce all of them right at the same time. And so essentially, which product in that environment takes priority? So bottlenecks are constraints that restrict the rate at which the product services can produce, leading to inefficiencies, potentially delaying the completion of the entire process. So essentially, it's some bottleneck is like a capacity constraint, right? A amount of labor, amount of machine hours. And the idea here is that you want to produce first the product, maximize the production of the product. There's a maximum contribution margin per capacity constraint, right? The one that gives you the biggest bang for your buck in terms of utilizing that, in terms of exploiting that constraint. And that's what a bottleneck pricing is about in chapter 24 of Warren et al., which is available in eReserves. There's an example of that, how we deal with the heat process. And we'll look at a couple of examples of that. All right, so the key is there to unit contribution margin per bottleneck constraint. As you take the contribution margin divided by the sort of whatever is the measure of constraint is, which is labor hours, machine hours, whatever, and you go with the one that is the highest contribution margin per bottleneck constraint. Right, so that's kind of the overview of the theory of of today, right? So I know I kind of went through this fast, and I think it's much easier to understand in examples, right? So